Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also 92.1. That's a great radio station, WFOV. Want to give a shout out to all the listeners at the two stations and also to Mr. Paul Herring, the visionary here in Flint, who is the person behind the setup of the programs over there at WFOV, and they're doing an excellent job of bringing great listening programs to the audiences that they are able to reach. I always say that wish they had more voltage because the kind of programming they're doing deserves a much wider audience, but we will go with what we have and continue to work on it and expand our base both here and at that particular studio, and we hope we will gain more and more listeners in the future because we're here to stay, and I'm sure they are there for the long run as well. I also want to thank the technicians here at allpointstv.com because we come before those of us who do the program, we come before the cameras and take all of the credit for what goes on here, but without the technicians who are doing the lights and also the sound and other things that go on behind the scenes, without them we would not be able to carry forth the programs that we're doing. So I want to give a shout out to those technicians who are working very hard at the studio to bring the quality of programs they have here at allpointstv.com. I want to continue our discussion that we had last week. We were talking about the use of Abraham Lincoln, and I had to figure out myself why Abraham Lincoln is put up there at the very top of the presidents of the United States, even above the great George Washington, who I consider to be the only great president this country has had, because my premise is that politicians are not great. The motives of society are the ones who are great. You can read, I think that's the premise of the book by Ayn Rand. You can read her book, Atlas Shrugged. This is the premise of that book, that the motives of society, the ones that really make these societies move and go in a certain direction, the ones that produce and create wealth, they are the motives. And therefore, the ones who are great in society are those who are the producers, who are given no credit for it. And that is why in that book by Ayn Rand, she writes that the motives of society, John Galt and others, Atlas Shrugged. Well, I wanted to bring to the studio a discussion about Abraham Lincoln and some other topics as well, but we'll start with Abraham Lincoln since they're still doing these fictional accounts of the history of the United States, and they're using Abraham Lincoln in this program that they have on Fox Sundays. They're doing Legends, a program called Legends and Lies, and they don't realize that they're fabricating more lies with the program they're doing, because the legend, Abraham Lincoln is a legend, they are not really clear. I don't think it's purposeful. I just don't think they're clear on the real reasons why this country fought a civil war. There's been so much folklore written about it, and also so much folklore written about slavery, that you have to do a lot of digging to ferret out what really happened and what the facts are surrounding these two events, slavery on the one hand, and then the Civil War, which supposedly was fought because of slavery on the other hand. And I think that we've got to go back. If we are going to move forward, we got to first of all understand the past as we're standing in the present, looking to go forward into the future. We've got to have an understanding of what has really happened that has led to this day, and this day how this leads into the days yet to come. But if we're not clear about history, then, as the statement says, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And I think that the pivotal part of our history has to be the history of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln has been used, in my estimation, based upon the documentation that I have come across, to spread a couple of premises that are not true, one of which is that the politicians are the benevolent leaders of the society, and that what they've done here was to act out of humanitarian impulses, so that what they have done, any mistakes they made it in behalf of trying to do the right thing by the American people. And any mistakes they made is just they made mistakes because they, in trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number, they sometimes have made certain faux pas that have interrupted and neutralized their good intent. And I think that's the persona that's been placed before the American people in terms of Abraham Lincoln, who is considered to be the greatest of the presidents we've had in this country. And it is appalling to me that anyone would place presidents above the founder of the country, George Washington, who, despite his impediments that we all have, by the way, and his shortcomings, none are perfect, that George Washington will be superseded by other presidents, not only Abraham Lincoln, but I've seen some polls where historians have placed Franklin Delano Roosevelt above George Washington as the second of the presidents in terms of their greatness. And that's another travesty. So let's try to, today in our discussion, let's try to maybe go into some of the particulars to ferret out the real history of the country so we can get a handle on what we need to be doing in order to move forward, because this false history is being promoted is what has us tearing down monuments in this country, and is further dividing the country by having some that want the monuments torn down and some that look at it as part of the heritage of their forefathers, and that these persons now clashing with each other. And we've got to end these feuds that are going on in this country, that these feuds being fueled by a falsification of history, which brings about a falsification of consciousness. And the American character is at stake here, so we've got to go back and try to ferret out the real history of the country in order to be about the business of mending some of the frictions that are occurring both in the political landscape and also in the social fabric of the country at this present time. I brought this book back to the studio, written by James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy. This book called The South Was Right. And in a previous program, I was trying to make it very clear that in saying the South was right is not to say that the South was right in terms about its practice of slavery. But I have made the point on a number of occasions that the so-called Civil War was not a war over slavery. So when I say that I endorse the concept of the two Kennedy brothers, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy, in saying the South was right, I am not saying, nor are they saying, that slavery was right. They're saying the South was right in terms of standing up and defending itself based upon the unconstitutional encroachment upon the South by the Union that was fighting another war similar to the war that was fought in 1776, which was a war fought over taxation. In other words, we've had two major taxation wars in this country, one at the founding moments of the country, and another tax war that was fought, major tax war was fought in 1861, beginning with the firing of Fort Sumter, April the 12th of that year. So April the 12th, 1861. And that war would last 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, in which 700,000 persons would die both on the battlefield and also the number of civilian casualties. Combined with that and the battlefield deaths, about 700,000 American lives were lost. And my contention is, and I don't think any historian worth his salt would challenge this unless they have an agenda, which most of them do, and the agenda is that of the rulers, that they would have in a contention with the premise that this was a war that was based upon taxation policies of the United States. I don't really know how they can bring another conclusion than that, given the fact that in terms of slavery, slavery was on both sides of the divide. The South had slaves, obviously, in its population, probably 3,500,000 slaves at the point of the Civil War, but there were also slaves in the Union states. and you can call them border states to hide that fact, but it is not less than the fact that in the Union there were also slaves, between 500 and 800,000 slaves in the so-called border states, which is nothing other than a way of hiding that these were Union states, because all states are border states. They have their own borders, and those borders are what defines them from the state next to it and also other states inside of the continental and the part of the United States not continental, meaning that the states that are not contiguous, touching each other, such as Alaska and Hawaii. All states have borders. So to call a state a border state is a part of the misdirection I'm trying to get at here in terms of putting into place what this war was really about. This was a tax war. It was the second big tax war this country has fought. But when you read American history and you read it through the lens of economics, which is one of my master's degrees, then you see that there is an economic component to the war that's not been brought into public view. There is an economic component in the sense that this war mimics in many ways the war that was fought at the founding moments of the country. And the South, by the way, is employing the same documents to bear upon the war that were brought upon the war in 1776 when they had the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. And the South is using the Declaration of Independence, founded at July the 2nd, written July the 2nd. It was completed by July the 2nd of 1776, and ratified pretty much by the Parliament at that time, and that is, say, the continental government at that time, July the 4th, which is the day we celebrate the document. But the document really was drafted in July the 2nd. 2 days later, you see the document being endorsed. And so we celebrate July 4th as a date of the Declaration of Independence, but its actual drafting and its endorsement was 2 days earlier. The South is using that document also as of 1861, and they're declaring their independence from the Union in terms of their declaring their independence because of the taxation policies that was benefiting the northern states to the disadvantage of the southern states. And their objection is financial, as it was at the beginning of the nation's history, and that's why they're using the same document and have declared their independence. And it is out of that declaration that they are now fighting the same war that was fought by the founding fathers. And in a very interesting way, the South is in the embodiment of the founders, because they left the British Empire with their slaves, and that is the same thing that's going on here. The South is withdrawing, and they are withdrawing with the slaves intact, and that lends itself to this misconception that this war is over slavery. And that's where the misconception has occurred through these historians that have not seen that the issue was taxation. They have not seen that. And it's amazing to me that has been overlooked by historians. I think some of them probably have not overlooked it, but just have not had the courage to write about it.
I'd like to know this. A lot of times nowadays, a lot of our perceptions of historical periods are formed by images we see in movies. In this case, because the Civil War and the aftermath and a lot of that, of course, there's that famous one, Gone with the Wind. Okay, we all know that. It was centered around that time and all that. But I mean, do you think Hollywood maybe had a hand in this too? I mean, because we always try to tie this with, media and its impact on the way we perceive things, the way history is retold, or given on to another generation. So
yeah, Hollywood. Margaret Mitchell's book you're talking about that was published in 1937, and then Gone with the Wind, 1939, the movie version of it. That's certainly a part of it in terms of the media images. I mean, we're bombarded with the media images, and certainly they have an impact upon the level of consciousness of the people, because these visual images are very powerful, and they have a tremendous subliminal effect, which is written about in the 3-volume works of Wilson Bryan Key, whose major one of those 3 books he wrote, the one called Subliminal Seduction. and then the other two, which one called Media Sexploitation, and then the Clam Plate Orgy and Other Subliminal Images. Those 3 volumes by Wilson Bryan Keith talks about the impact of the media, which we all see that's a great impact. Anything that it was not on television, then to a lot of persons it did not occur. But if you put it on TV and put it in people's living rooms, then you can see the impact that would have, being that it's so personalized in terms of the images. So yes, Hollywood has played a vital role in our imagery, and it plays a very big role in it right now. Anyone watching multiple hours of TV and the accumulation effect of that over a period of time, you just have to consider yourself to be brainwashed.
My grandfather grew up across the street from a man who was rather famous. And he was here in Flint. He grew up right across the street. It was at Crapple Street over here in Flint. He grew up right across the street from a guy who had been a veteran of the Civil War. My grandfather was born in the 1900s. I can't remember the exact year. But anyway, the guy wrote a book about it. His last name is Foote. Now, it's not the one that came out years ago, just recently, with books on the Civil War. But this guy had been a Civil War veteran. He had been a 15-year-old, enlisted, and he was a drummer. And he had actually been caught and was a POW down in, one of the southern states. And he wrote about his exploits. And it's one of the most often referred to books when they talk about the Civil War. But the reason why I'm stating that, I just wish I had sat down with my grandfather and talked about this. Did he ever talk to this guy about this? But my grandfather was a very closed-mouth person, believe it or not. As much as I'm a talker, my grandfather wasn't, okay? Yeah. So, but we have the shared name. I'm named after him, but it was but the thing is, another bad thing about it too, the guy's house who was living across the street was tore down a few years ago. Now that should have been a historical landmark, but it wasn't. It was tore down, just rather callously, just tore down. And so was my grandfather's house, but it was in bad shape because people had destroyed it over the years. But
John, every time an old person dies, a library, the equivalent of a library, has been burned. Those oldsters who lived during the time and lived the history that's written about later on by historians, by those that lived through the times and have a personal relationship with that which is later on reported, those are the libraries, those are the citadels of information.
Because I sat down and talked to my grandparents a lot about other subjects. I mean, I knew a lot of history my sister doesn't know about because I was more interested in history. And they were like, even though they weren't like pivotal players in it, they were observers. They were all part of it. They weren't the leaders and the directors of it, but they did have a hand in it. They had their perceptions, they had their opinions on it. And it gave me a lot of perspective. And I used to talk to, matter of fact, growing up here, the woman lived down the street, her family was from Europe, and actually her brother had been a Wehrmacht soldier during the Second World War. He used to go around spraying people's fruit trees in the spring and stuff, or keep, bugs off so you can get, viable fruit. And I sat around and talked to him about it, and I heard his perspective. Because, the Germans are considered the bad guys and all this stuff. Well, he was actually an Austrian, but Hitler was from Austria. But anyway, I sat around and talked to him several times about his war experience, and it was horrific. And it made me realize that then, I was like 10, 11, 12 years old when I was talking to this guy, and it made me realize that it wasn't as clear-cut. The war wasn't clear-cut as we've been shown in the movies.
John, not only that, you're making a good point here, and not only that, but the history of the South in the aftermath of the Civil War is not what is being reported. I'm a Southerner, and I was raised from grades, throughout my 12 years of public schooling, and then I went to a college in the South. I went to Knoxville College in Tennessee. And so the first 22 years of my life is spent in the South. And so a lot of what is being reported, even in the aftermath of the Civil War, then during the time period in which you had the segregationist actions taking place in the southern states, mimicking the history that had been passed down from the time of the Civil War into a more modern time period. I, being a Southerner, can testify, having lived through that time period, and the segregationist part of the South, can testify to the history that's been written be untrue based upon my having gone through it and having lived through it. A lot of what is being written about that time period is also untrue. It's written for the same reason that the history has been written about Abraham Lincoln, to protect the politicians. The segregationist part of the South is really a history of the politicians in the South. And this idea of spreading it as a part of the Southern character and things of that sort. That is a way of protecting the politicians who run the racial narrative in order to stay in power in the South, because if they'd done otherwise, those blacks who are now who will be freely able to express themselves politically would have gone to the polls and voted against those politicians in the South, and they would have lost their power. So using the racial landscape in order to further the power of the political class in the southern states, and this umbrella painting all the Southerners as being a part of this landscape, and they were the driving force behind it, is not true. It is the George Wallaces, the Sheriff Clarks, and those power brokers who are driving that engine. But getting back to the Civil War and the use of Abraham Lincoln, we can see the same thing as a simile being used there. That is, say, using Abraham Lincoln's persona, that is which has been created about Abraham Lincoln in the aftermath of the Civil War as a great emancipator, is to say then that politicians in general are these philanthropic types of people that run for office, and they're trying to do the greatest good for the greatest many in the United States, and their intent, not sometimes frustrated, but their intent is to do the right thing by the American people. And these are public servants who are trying to further the ends of the country and not to further their own ends in terms of any personal and selfish types of motivations and ambitions.
Yeah, but
and I don't want to be a part of that nonsense. I want to try to pour some water on that particular parade.
Yeah, well, I was just saying, did you see the thing that they sent out on Facebook? I know you're no longer on Facebook, but Paul Ryan, who decided not to seek re-election, he was in there since '98 in his seat. He had, when he entered office, he had a net worth of a little over $300,000. Can't exact. Anyway, now he's worth over $6 million. So, I mean, I think that's very fair compensation for service to his country, don't you? Yeah. To his constituents. So.
Yeah, they are not enriching themselves, right? When half the members of Congress are millionaires, only 1% of the people in the general population are millionaires, but 50% of the members of Congress are, but they're not doing anything but representing the people and doing the greatest good for the greatest number. That's if you believe that, then you are ready for the property to be sold to you in Siberia. The Lincoln myth is part of that in terms of how they use the Lincoln myth to drive home the idea, and it's a subliminal idea that's being driven home, that the politicians are basically benevolent, and they are not askings, and they're not in pursuit of power. They're not askings of anything in terms of personal remuneration. They are just simply there as public servants, and they're trying to further the ends of the country and not to further their own personal ends. They are public servants, and you hear this all the time being promoted. And I would say nothing is further from the truth, but that is the kind of thing that they're doing. I think Lincoln's image is one of the ways in which they're parroting this view in the public domain. I want to read the back of the book by the Kennedy brothers. The South Was Right. On the jacket of the book, it says, "An authoritative and documented study of the mythology behind Civil War history and its lasting effects on contemporary society. The South Was Right uncovers evidence that the South was an independent country, invaded, captured, and occupied by a vicious aggressor. The authors maintain through rigorous research that the South had a legal precedent to succeed and a right to defend its borders. Even today, it has been, let me read that again, even today, it has just as much right to reclaim its liberty as the people of Poland, the Baltic states, Palestine, and the former Soviet Union have done. Southerners should read this book with a sense of urgency and obligation to the past. Others should read it with an open mind." The Critical Review writes this statement about the book. It says, "I was stunned by the scholarly material presented to show the Union account, and thus posterity's account, of the Civil War to be but a myth, a lie, a masterful piece of propaganda. That's in the Critical Review. Larry Lawrence, Abilene Reporters News, wrote this particular response to the book. Okay, we're coming up on a break at this point. John, thank you for reminding us of the break. And we'll take a hiatus for 4 minutes as far as the listeners from WFOV, and to be back with us in 4 minutes. We will continue what we're doing here at allpointstv.com, and I'll continue reading this jacket of the book called The South Was Right by the Kennedy brothers. Larry Lawrence, Abilene Reporters News, wrote, "Every once in a while, a book is published by a non-New York publishing house, which could shake up the country and possibly change the thinking of a lot of people. The South Was Right is one such book." David Hardin, the Tampa Tribune-Times, wrote, quote, "A respite from Yankee history whose exclamation point and some typefaces is rather like a cannon being fired." And then the PD Magazine wrote, quote, "An arsenal of information for partisans of the South." And the whole book is premised upon the fact that the war was not fought for the reasons that they're claiming, the North being triumphant in the war, writing in his own name that it was not fighting a war of aggression, but fighting a war over slavery, has written that this war was won to free the slaves. And that's what's going on with this Legend and Lies they have on Fox Network that I'm watching now on a weekly basis as they update this fallacy and they continue this charade that Lincoln was the greatest of the presidents, and his greatness was that he was so torn by the practice of slavery in the United States that he was determined to end slavery and was willing to engage in a war which no other society practicing slavery had engaged in to end slavery. He was so torn by slavery that he was willing to engage in a war to end the horrors of this institution. There were horrors of this institution without any question. I'm not trying to say in any stretch of the imagination that this was not a horrible institution, but but slavery was a universal institution. And where it was practiced, it was horrible where it was practiced. And wherever it was ended in the Western states, it was ended without the sacrifice of his own citizens to bring the result about. And it was on his way out. It was on his way out here in the United States.
You know, I'd like to know this. In the scripture, you know, most of this country is mostly identified with being a Christian or formerly Christian nation. I don't know how they, I mean, in the New Testament teachings never talks about having a problem with slavery. It just said slaves be good slaves and masters be good to your slaves. That's it. I mean, and it should have been denounced. I mean, it should have. In our estimation, in this way we're looking at perspective, I just wondered, I was always puzzled how allegedly Christian nations could allow that to happen, you know?
Yes, that's in Ephesians 6:5 that you're quoting. Slaves obey your masters, but what it shows is the universality of slavery as an institution. But the way it's being parroted here is that as if the U.S. was in fact practicing something that was not practiced anywhere else, and no better place to read about how much of a fallacy that is than in the book written by the great Thomas Sowell, one of the premier thinkers in this country, that wrote a book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. I think we're coming back now. We're coming back now with the listeners at WFOV, and we're glad to have you back. And we hope you will stay tuned for the next 30 minutes or so that we have left in the program. The point we're making right now has to do with we're still talking about the Lincoln myth. And the Lincoln myth is still a part of the folklore of this country. Lincoln, the great emancipator. And the program on Fox, I was saying this earlier, the program on Fox is continuing to parrot this view that Lincoln was brought to the Emancipation Proclamation by his dealings with certain abolitionists who finally caused him to see the light, and then the war's characters changed because now Lincoln is determined to free the slaves in the United States. And that's another myth that the Kennedy brothers, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy, are writing about in the book called The South Was Right. Lincoln, at no point was Lincoln an emancipator. At no point. And the reason why that would be true, despite the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on January the 1st, 1863, is that none of the language in that document of the Emancipation Proclamation had any effect upon the slavery where slavery was being practiced in the places where Lincoln had control. Let me read something to you from the Emancipation Proclamation. And I want to read what is in the document, and then I want to read the part of that statement that is in this film sequence, Legends and Lies, that's being promoted by Fox, in terms of what they have said about the document. But I want to read the whole quote, first of all, from the document itself, and then show how Fox has made use of it in terms of them editing out some prominent parts of the statement. In the second paragraph, excuse me, in the second paragraph of the Emancipation Proclamation, it says, and this is Lincoln speaking, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do not and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they make for the actual freedom. Now, let's go back to what was on Fox's past Sunday. Here's what Fox did with the statement. All persons held as slaves. Let me go down to the other part of it. Shall be free, and that's what they did. That's what they did with it. They said that they edited out the parts about the rebellious states, and they stated all persons held as slaves shall be thenceforward and forever free, and that's not what the document said. That's an edited version of it in terms of taking some of the words that's in the context of the paragraph and editing out the relevant parts and saying that those slaves that are in the rebellious states as of January 1, 1863, in those states still in rebellion against the United States, it is saying that the slaves in those states shall be free. But there is no control that Lincoln has in those states. And when you understand that the border states, those states called the border states, have slaves, and that the border states are Union states, and that they have slaves in those 4 border states, as they call them, then the Emancipation Proclamation does not free any slaves because it does not touch any of the slaves in the Union states or in the border states. It only deals with the states that are the slaves in the states that are in rebellion, and there is no control of those states by Abraham Lincoln because they have their own president there. And that's what the Kennedy brothers are talking about when they said, when the jacket says, an authoritative and documented study of the mythology behind Civil War history and its lasting effects on contemporary society. The South Was Right uncovers evidence the South was an independent country invaded, captured, and occupied by a vicious aggressor. what they're saying there is that the South has succeeded from the Union, and the South had eventually, those 11 states had their own president, their own parliament. You can call it the Confederacy. They had their own elected officials in those 11 states, and those states were in fact invaded by the northern aggressor. And they were invaded not because of slavery, because slavery was also in the Union states. It makes no sense to say the wars over slavery, that when the Emancipation Proclamation that was issued did not cover any of the slaves, did not end any of the slave conditions in the Union states, the so-called border states, which were Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky.
Now, what states that were originally part of the 12 didn't allow slavery? I mean, I used to think Pennsylvania didn't, because that was started by Quakers and stuff like that. But I guess later on they did have slaves in there, because I think Ben Franklin, I found out, had a slave, or at least a few of them. And I was surprised with that.
Yeah, well, the slaves in the Union states were those 4 states I just mentioned. But in terms of the beginning parts of the country, states were in the northern states had slaves as well, but slavery was not as conducive in the northern states because of the the geographical issues that's involved, the climate issues that were involved.
Yeah, because it wasn't like in the rocky area of the New England coast and stuff like that. They didn't have plantations.
You didn't have plantations. Right. And slavery will die out because the North is becoming industrialized, and so slavery has no utility in the northern states. Because
I know that I read the book years ago by Esther Forbes called Johnny Tremaine. You probably remember that book, don't you?
I do.
And they talked about slaves, and they were in Massachusetts. They were in Boston, and there was a slave that she was at the back door, and she accidentally thrown some water on and landed on Johnny Tremaine, the main character. And I remember that comment. He was going to turn around and curse her because, give her like disparaging remarks because she was a slave. But she was real apologetic and brought him in the house and cleaned him up and gave him something to drink, whatever. But I remember the story. But there were slaves in Massachusetts, and that was a painstaking research book, even though it fictionalized characters. It was the events around it were actually solid, historical, accurate things. And the mention of slavery was kind of surprising me when I was a kid, because I always thought the eastern seaboard states didn't have slavery as well. I thought that was a southern thing.
Another point you made in the past, John, which is also critical to this conversation, is that the secessionist idea is not born in the South. The secessionist idea is born in New England. Massachusetts had threatened to succeed from the Union after the character union was changed by the addition of the Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson in 1803. And the reason for the secessionist movement at that point, Massachusetts being in the lead of it, was that it would change the character of power in the United States, because Massachusetts had borne two of the first 6 presidents. John Adams, the second president, and John Quincy Adams, who had been elected in 1824, the 6th president. Those 2 presidents were from Massachusetts. In fact, only 2 states had borne the first 6 presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. Those 4 presidents were from Virginia. So Virginia had borne 4 presidents of the first 6. Massachusetts of the other 2.
And Ohio's had quite a few of them coming up there too.
Over time, you'll see the shift going from the South to the North. But during this time, the South and Massachusetts, Virginia and Massachusetts were the power brokers, and the Louisiana Purchase threatens to change that power dynamic. And so the secession movement was started in the New England states, and Massachusetts is at the head of that. This idea of states' rights is not Southern born. That will be picked up by the South later on, because they also have a states' right issue.
I forgot about the Massachusetts agitating for secession at one time, secession. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I read about it one time, but I forgot about it. So
historians are not going to talk about it in the books that are being promoted, because it takes the narrative away from the South standing up on states' rights as a Southern issue. It's not a Southern issue. It's a New England issue. But it becomes an issue of other states who also advance the idea they have rights. And those are not rights that are extant outside of the Constitution. Those are rights that are guaranteed inside the Constitution, recognized by the framers, without which there would have been no Constitution and there would have been no United States. Why are the states' rights in the Constitution, by the way? Because the states are writing the document. The states are the ones writing the Constitution. It is their representatives that are drawing and drafting the Constitution in Philadelphia. And that's why the states are delegating its powers to the federal government and then itemizing what the states' powers were delegated to the federal government were. They're telling the federal government in Article 1, Section 8, you have this power, you have that power, but you don't have any other powers. They are enumerating, they're dictating, they're delegating the powers to the federal government. The states are saying these are the powers that we are, in fact, surrendering to the federal government voluntarily, so as to prescribe and limit the powers that the federal government has. And they're not satisfied with just having done that. They now want to have, in addition to the articles that found the country, they want to have a Bill of Rights added to further ensure that the federal government would not go out of control. What Lincoln is showing later on is that the federal government had gone out of control, because now you have the child of the parent stepping on the mother that was the child's creation and telling the mother what it could and could not do, based upon the federal government now having grown strong enough to tell the states that they had no right to, in fact, secede from the Union. And the states always retained the right to secede from the Union. And that's why this war is a war over secession, later on turned into a war over slavery. And the legend and lies are not going to touch that. What it did this past Sunday was something very interesting, and that was to start with Frederick Douglass. And there's a 5-volume work out you can read on Douglass and his writings and his speeches that has been gathered by the great editor Philip S. Foner, who wrote a introduction to that 5-volume work that he did. It's very good to read the writings of Douglass and also the speeches that Douglass made, which are chronicled by Foner in that book. Volume 3 deals with the speech that Douglass made on July the 4th, 1852, which was quoted, part of it was quoted in the Legend and Lies program on Fox this past Sunday. And they tried to make it appear that Douglass, who was calling for the ending of slavery, had somehow influenced through his abolitionist work. They'd influenced Abraham Lincoln, who finally caught the zetas, caught the spirit of abolition, and then he becomes an abolitionist as President of the United States. And nothing could be further from the truth when you understand what really was going on here. This war, called the Civil War, really a war over secession, was a war to bring the South back into the Union. What Lincoln is claiming is that they had no right to secede from the Union, but when you understand how the Union was actually founded by the states, which ceded some of their sovereignty to the federal government in order to create the federal government, when you understand that was voluntary, you understand that the secession was in fact constitutional. And it had been called for in terms of when there were certain specific interests that were in challenging the interests of the northern states, they claimed the right to secede also. The South was simply declaring after the fact that they had the right to secede because the taxation policy of the Union was affecting them in a way that was deleterious to the interests of the South. Now the northern hypocrites, which are claiming it for themselves, are not claiming that the South had the right to it, although they claimed it earlier. And that's a large part of this hypocrisy was going on at that time, and it's being perpetuated by these Legend and Lies. This program called Legend and Lies, they're doing another program on the Civil War, so-called Civil War, is perpetuating the same myth. This war is not over slavery. Slavery is not the cause of this war. Slavery is a consequence of the war. And when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, and you understand that the Emancipation did not touch any of the slaves in the Union states, and I'm going to call them Union states. They call them the agenda setters, those who have an agenda other than the truth. I'll call them border states. I'm going to call them what they are. They're Union states. You had slavery in the Union states. And I'll name those states again. Go and check these states out and read about these states. Maryland was a border state, quote unquote. It was a union state. Another border state, which was a union state, Delaware. Another union state is called a border state, Kentucky. And a fourth union state called a border state, Missouri, created by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It is also a union state. You can call it a border state, but all states have borders. And California, this part of the discussions for you. All states have borders. And all countries have borders. And if you don't have borders, if you don't respect borders of a country, you don't have a country. So you can get off that right now out there with Jerry Brown out there. But the border states is a misnomer because without borders, you can't have states. And without borders, you can't have countries. That's what makes countries, borders. So the border state, as you can see then, is a way of getting around that these union states have slaves, to further and fan this nonsense that this war is over slavery. It can't be over slavery if you have slavery in both the South and in the Union States. It can't be over slavery if you have slaves in the northern states, which the Emancipation Proclamation did not, in fact, change the slavery in those states. You saw where I just read that the slaves in the rebellious states are the states that Lincoln is claiming to free those slaves. But didn't you just read in the back of this? Did I just read in the back of this book? The South was right that the South had its own. They say on the back cover that evidence that the South was an independent country, invaded, captured, and occupied by, and they claim their words are, quote unquote, a vicious aggressor.
Well, I know that back down south.
That's a whole different landscape, isn't it, John?
Yeah, in the 80s and 80s, I remember hearing about Southern textbooks would call that, refer to the Civil War as a war of northern aggression. They were already calling that back in the 80s. So.
That's another name for it. It is a war of northern aggression. They asked the soldiers, why were they fighting with such tenacity? And the Confederate soldiers said, we're fighting because you're down here. You're down here. That's what we're fighting. They're not fighting to maintain slavery. Slavery was going out because of the advent of capitalism.
That I've argued that before. People try to tell me that capitalism gave rise to slavery, and there was always a form of capitalism behind it. I went, you're absurd, okay? Because basically, if you just look at the bottom line of capitalism, it's to get work done as cheap as possible. Buying people is very costly. Okay, if you just want to put it, look at the side of the human terms, but just look at the financial terms, it's a costly thing because you're now responsible for every part of their existence. Food, clothing, shelter, everything else, you're on the hook for. So it doesn't make sense, Cal, just from that perspective alone, you know.
John, you're doing a lot of reading, so you've uncovered a lot of this information we're talking about. But the average American will watch that series on Fox, and they'll just have it corroborated what they've learned in public schools, that this war was a war to end slavery. They will see slavery as a cause of the war rather than a consequence of the war. And rather than saying the Emancipation Proclamation as a proclamation to free the slaves, it should be seen in the context of the war itself. And that would make the war, the Emancipation Proclamation, therefore, as a war document. This is a military document. And Lincoln was called upon to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, quite frankly, because they did not any longer entertain the folklore, I should say, the myth that this war could be ended without bringing about the ending of slavery in the rebellious states, because slavery was in fact allowing the South to have an economic basis for its war. So Lincoln is now trying to undercut the base of the war in the South by, in fact, issuing emancipation of the slaves, hoping to create a rebellion in the South to weaken the South's ability to fight this war. In other words, Lincoln was willing to create an insurrection in the country in order to further the ends of the Union to bring the South back into compliance with the mandates of the Union. This is not a humanitarian document. This is a military document. And those historians who are still babbling about the war being over slavery, they either are ignorant of the fact or they are deceiving the American people with what they know best is not true, but they're not right about. This war is not over slavery. The Civil War is a second war of secession in this country. And the document the South is using is the same document that Jefferson used at the founding of the country in terms of declaring the independence of the South. And they used the Declaration of Independence to bring that about. The South is really fighting a war in the image of the framers. And this is not a call for slavery. It's nonsense to parrot the idea that to say the South was right is to say the South was right about slavery. That's a different issue. If you can understand the war fought between 1861 and 1865 was not fought over slavery, then you can conclude the truth. The truth being the South was right over its advancement of the idea that there are states' rights that cannot be abrogated by the federal government. And those of you that are now understanding that issue can see what we have to deal with right now in the federal government being out of control today. The federal government is totally out of control. And if you think we're going to elect a president inside of the swamp that's going to drain the swamp, hello, Donald J. Trump. I mean, it's not going to happen. And not saying that you fight the battle in the way in which the South was fighting the battle. I'm simply making the point that the issue of the federal government being out of control has not changed from the issue that's raised by the South. The South raised the issue. The federal government had no right to, in fact, go across certain constitutional lines. And the South picked up arms against the federal government because they had crossed the line. The lines that were in fact drawn by Article 1, Section 8, and also the lines that were in fact drawn in the further additions to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, particularly as it relates to the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment further draws out limitations of the federal government's power. And they were not willing to stay within those limits. That's what this war is about. And if we don't understand that, we will continue to fight these battles among ourselves as they turn us against each other. I'm trying to get this country, well, I don't have the power to do it. I'm saying what I'm trying to do through these discussions is to lower the temperature of the country, which is being pitted against each other by these politicians who want to be seen as the benevolent, benevolent dictators, if anything, but these benevolent, rulers or these benevolent elected officials, they want you to see them in that light when these persons are in fact dividing this country. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they are practicing divisional politics, using the imagery of Abraham Lincoln as one part of that, to bring us to the conclusion that the answers are residing in Washington, D.C., that they are going to be the ones that's going to resolve the problems of the nation when they're causing the problems of the nation. Almost every, I would go so far as to say, quite frankly, that every problem we're facing in this country can be placed as something that's occurred in the nation's capital. And that's a very profound statement to make, because it seems like it'd be just the opposite. The welfare programs are coming out of Washington. The fact that we have the government giving out health care, the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these things that are coming by what seems to be the benevolence of the federal government, until you recognize the fact that the federal government doesn't have any money to do these things. And before the government can dispense with $1, it must first of all confiscate $1. And I say that in the days preceding the confiscation of wealth by the American people again this year, as has been done in the past, or since 1913 with the passing of the 16th Amendment, where the federal government seizes wealth before it can distribute any wealth. So that's nothing to be, there's no charity here, because the federal government is first of all seizing wealth and then dispensing in his own name. That's not charity, because the money doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the people that it stole it from. But let's understand another part of this dynamic. What was going on before the federal government had the money through its confiscatory policies to give out these different caveats to the American people? You know where they came from? It came from the American people that were out there befriending other Americans and sharing their resources through hospitality with each other, which kept the government out of the arena of doing that work. That was real charity there. Different organizations set up to fulfill the welfare mission, people that you knew about. The government came in and seized the money in its name and then dispensed it. That's not charity at all. That's the government hiding its theft. And they're continuing this narrative of what this war was about to make it appear that Lincoln was the benefactor, and then through that image of Lincoln, the politicians are that today. And that is not true. We'll continue this discussion, and we are going to continue to talk about this, because we've got to get the history straight before we go forward. Okay, until next week, we want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.